Wyoming Territory, January 1882, the snow had fallen hard the night before, and by dawn it was a white world, quiet and cruel. Odette O'Malley stepped off the last stagecoach stop at Bitter Creek with her carpetbag clutched close and her fingers stiff with cold. She had not seen a tree in 3 hours, and not one soul had spoken to her since the driver grunted and pointed toward the trail north. "This is as far as I go," he had said before snapping the reins and rolling away, leaving her skirts flapping in the wind like a forgotten flag. She had answered a letter, one she had read again and again in her small boarding room in St. Louis. A widowed cowboy with 2 children seeking a wife, a real home, a new start. She had nothing left in Missouri but a grave with her sister's name on it and a mounting debt she could not pay. So she came. Only now, standing in the middle of this frozen emptiness, she began to wonder if she had made a mistake. The letter had said to follow the trail north for 3 miles to the cabin. She could do that. She had walked farther in worse shoes. The wind scraped across her cheeks as she walked, boots sinking into the snow. By the 2nd mile her toes were nearly numb. Then the howling started, low at first, far off, then another, closer. She turned, heart hammering. Gray shapes flickered between the trees to her right, shadows moving fast over the snow, her breath caught. Wolves. She ran, the snow dragged at her skirts, her bag slipped from her hand. She looked back once, 5 of them, maybe 6, their eyes glowing, their gait easy and sure while she stumbled like a drunk through the drifts. She fell once, then again, her knees soaked through. The wolves slowed, circling now. One crept closer, teeth bared. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears. A shot rang out. The crack of it echoed across the snow like thunder. The lead wolf staggered, yelped, then turned and bolted. The others followed, vanishing back into the trees like smoke. She blinked. A man on horseback rode toward her from the ridge to the west, rifle still raised. His coat was dusted with snow, dark hair under a wide-brimmed hat, and something in his posture steady, tense. All instinct made her heart stutter in her chest. "You all right?" he called as he swung down from the saddle. She nodded, though her legs were shaking too hard to stand. He reached her fast, crouched beside her in the snow. "You hurt?" "No," she managed. "I am Odette O'Malley. I was supposed to meet a Mr. Levi Dalton." "He sent for me." The man's jaw tightened. "You came all this way alone?" "Yes, I am Clayton Graves. Levi was my neighbor," he said. "He died 2 weeks ago. Fever took him fast." Her mouth fell open. "But the letter." "He must have sent it before he got sick." She stared at the snow, at the blood where the wolf had been. "He said he had 2 children. What happened to them?" Clayton glanced at the hills. "Still at the cabin. I have been checking in on them, bringing food. They are young." 6 and 8. She stood, too fast, swaying. "They are alone." "Not anymore," he said. He led her to his horse, helped her up into the saddle, then swung up behind her. She could feel the heat of him through her coat, his arm around her waist to steady her as they rode toward the cabin. The snow started falling again. The cabin sat tucked in a hollow beneath tall pines, smoke curling from the chimney. Inside, the air was warm, the smell of stew thick in the air. 2 children sat at the table, 1 boy, maybe 8, and a little girl with dark braids. "Odette," Clayton said as he helped her down, "this is Cooper and Clara." Cooper's chin lifted. "Are you the lady who was going to marry our pa?" Odette froze. "Yes," she said softly, "I was." Clara climbed off the stool and came to her, wrapping thin arms around her legs. "You smell like cinnamon." Odette looked at Clayton, and something passed between them, something quiet, heavy, and real. He cleared his throat. "You can stay here tonight. I will sleep in the barn." "No," she said. "We will figure it out." That night she sat by the fire with the children curled beside her under quilts. Clayton stood by the door, watching, arms crossed. His eyes weren't cold, but guarded. "You saved my life," she said quietly. He nodded once. "You should never have been out there alone." "I did not expect to be," she replied. He looked at her a long moment. "You are strong, I see that." She met his gaze. "So are you." Outside, the wolves howled again, but farther off this time. Inside the cabin, it was warm, safe. And for the first time in weeks, she did not feel alone. By morning, the fire had burned down to coals. Odette stirred first, stiff beneath the heavy quilt, the weight of a small hand still curled against her side. Clara had tucked herself there sometime in the night, silent and trusting. She eased out from under the covers, careful not to wake her, and stood, her joints aching from the hard floor. The cabin was quiet but not empty. The boy, Cooper, sat cross-legged near the hearth, carving at a length of pine with a small knife. His eyes flicked up once, but he said nothing. The sound of the blade rasping against wood filled the hush. She moved to the stove, lifting the kettle and testing its weight. Still some water inside. She set it back gently and reached for the iron handle, adding wood from the stacked pile beside the hearth. "You ever cook on one of these?" Cooper asked without looking up. "Not often." She crouched and coaxed the fire back to life. "But I'm quick to learn," he nodded, still carving. "Pa used to burn biscuits," she smiled faintly. "Mine always came out heavy as stones." Outside, the barn door creaked open. A moment later, Clayton stepped into the cabin, brushing snow from his shoulders, his boots leaving damp prints across the floor. He looked at her, then the children. "Snow's easing," he said. "Skies clearing to the west. Might be a good day to ride in wood." "Do you always bring it in by sled?" she asked. "I cut and haul. Keep enough for a week stacked by the wall." She nodded, then hesitated. "Would you mind if I helped?" He studied her a moment. "You've got a good coat." "Yes." "Then come along." She borrowed a pair of boots from beside the door. They were too large but warm. Outside, the air was sharp and clean, the light bouncing off the ice-crusted branches of the pines. She followed him to the edge of the clearing where a sled waited, its runners half buried. He handed her a pair of leather gloves. "You don't strike me as the sort to stay inside while others work," he said. "I don't like sitting still," she replied. "Not when there's something needing done." They worked in tandem. He split the logs clean, each strike of the axe sure and measured. She stacked them on the sled, keeping pace. The rhythm came easy, and for a time there was only the sound of blade to wood, of snow crunching under their boots. "So," Clayton said after a while, setting another log upright, "what was it made you answer Levy's letter?" She paused, brushing hair from her face. "I needed to begin again. Missouri was finished for me." He didn't press. Instead, he gave a slight nod and kept working. When the sled was full, they returned to the cabin. Cooper opened the door before they reached it and helped unload, silent but watching. Clara had tied a kerchief around her doll's head and sat humming by the stove. Later, while the children napped, Odette stepped outside again. The sun rode low behind the hills, casting long shadows across the snow. She found Clayton near the corral, checking the fencing. He straightened when he saw her. "I was thinking," she said, folding her arms against the cold, "if you planned on keeping an eye on the children, it might be easier if you didn't have to ride so far." He leaned on the post, considering her. "I could stay," she said. "Not as a guest. We could fix the place up between us." "Make it work. You'd work this land. If I didn't, who else would?" Wind stirred the edge of her scarf. He looked past her then, toward the woods where the trees stood dark and still. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet. "I'd thought to sell it come spring. Take the children somewhere closer to town, but I don't know if they'd take to that. They'd be leaving everything they know." He nodded. "I could teach them," she added. "Whatever they need, I can learn to give." He met her gaze fully then, the guardedness in his face giving way to something steadier, something she recognized and didn't fear. "You'd stay through the thaw?" he asked. "I would, if you'd have me." He looked down at the snow, then back at her. "Then I reckon we've got work ahead." She smiled, and for the first time in weeks it wasn't forced. The day faded slow, the sky turning lavender and gold. Inside, the cabin was warm once more, the fire crackling, the scent of something baking filling the air. They shared supper at the table, the children's laughter easy now, the silence between adults no longer heavy but companionable. Outside, the pines stood still. No wolves came near, the wind shifted in March, less bitter, more restless. Days lingered longer, and the rim of the hills lost their white crowns. Odette stepped out early that morning with a pail in one hand and a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. The crust of snow gave beneath her boots, softening with the thaw. Clayton was already at the trough, checking the water. His shoulders, broad beneath a worn wool coat, moved with quiet purpose. He'd built a new gate last week, and the fence line no longer leaned with age. She noticed these things now, his way of fixing what needed fixing without saying much about it. "Creek's running high," he said without turning. "Might be a flood if it keeps melting fast." She stopped beside him. "Is that likely?" "Can't say. But I'll move the grain sacks to the loft, just in case." He dipped his hands into the trough and rubbed the back of his neck. The skin along his jaw was pink from the cold. "Clara's been asking about the hills," she said. "She wants to know if there are flowers under all that snow." "There are," he said. "Bluebells, wild columbine, they'll come soon enough." They walked back toward the cabin together, the silence not awkward, only full of small thoughts neither of them minded keeping for a little while longer. Inside, Cooper sat at the table, sharpening a pencil with his pocketknife and frowning with concentration. A slate and chalk lay beside him, and one of Odette's schoolbooks sat open to a page about the Mississippi River. "You reckon it's true?" he asked, without looking up. "That it takes 7 days to float clear from St. Paul to St. Louis," she set the pail down. "Depends on the current, and how hard you paddle." He nodded, satisfied with that. Later that week, they dug the root cellar deeper. Odette held the lantern while Clayton worked the soil with a spade. She stood near the ladder, careful not to step back too far. "Did your people farm?" he asked as he hauled up a bucket of damp earth. "My father was a sawyer, but my mother kept a garden. Big one, full of herbs and cabbage and greens I never learned the names of." "You know what you're planting here?" "Not yet," she said. "But I'll learn." He passed her the next bucket, their hands brushing in the exchange. The contact was brief, but her breath caught anyway, he noticed. His eyes didn't linger, but he didn't pull away too fast either. It wasn't the first time. There'd been small moments like that all winter, the way he handed her a tool, or how he paused when she walked into a room, like her presence meant something steadying. She'd come to expect it now, though she hadn't yet named the shape it was taking. That night, after the children were asleep, the wind picked up again. Odette sat in the old rocking chair, mending one of Clara's stockings by lamplight. Clayton stood near the hearth, adding another log to the fire. "Did you ever think you'd end up here?" she asked, not looking up. "I didn't think much past the next season," he said. "I came west after the war, thought I'd ride cattle, maybe drift a while. Instead, I bought land. You stayed." "I did," she set down the needle. "You ever wish you hadn't?" He turned, the firelight catching on the line of his cheek. "Before this winter, sometimes." She met his gaze fully then. He didn't look away. "I've thought about it," he said. "You, the children, this place, it's not nothing what we've built." Her throat tightened. "No, it isn't." He stepped closer slowly, giving her time to move if she meant to. She didn't. "I don't want to undo what's already grown here," he said, "but I wouldn't ask you for something you weren't offering." She stood, hands still at her sides. "I didn't come here expecting to stay." "Not after Levy." "I know, but I want to now." His jaw shifted. "I'd give you a good life, not perfect, but honest." "I believe that." Clayton reached for her hand, warm and rough and certain. She closed her fingers around his. Outside, the wind carried the sound of melting snow slipping from the eaves. Inside, the fire burned steady. The night held no fear in it, and for the first time since her train left the station in St. Louis, Odette felt something settle inside her, not relief, but belonging. A place to root. A hand to hold. A future made not of promises, but of days well lived, side by side. April came with swollen creeks and the scent of wet earth rising from thawed ground. Snow lingered in the shaded hollows, but the valley floor had softened to mud, and the first buds showed along the cottonwoods that lined the lower ridge. Odette stood by the garden plot behind the cabin, sleeves rolled to the elbow, palms smeared with loam. She pressed a row of onion sets into the ground with careful fingers, the soil damp and cool. The girl, Clara, crouched beside her with a small tin pail, dropping in seeds one by one. "Are they sleeping down there?" Clara asked, peering into the furrow. "They are," Odette answered. "But not for long." Clayton had built a low fence around the plot to keep out the mule deer that sometimes wandered close. It wasn't much to look at yet, just turned earth and a few hopeful rows, but she'd scribbled out a plan on scrap paper, and she meant to see it through. From the barn came the hollow thunk of a hammer. Clayton was framing a new stall long enough to hold another mare. He'd traded a half-barrel of oats for lumber from the sawmill east of Bitter Creek and hauled it back himself across the muddy trail. She dusted her hands on her skirt and stood. "You want to help me fetch the eggs?" Clara nodded and ran ahead. Inside the coop, the hens clucked low and lazy. Odette reached beneath a nesting hen and drew out a warm brown egg, placing it gently in the basket. Clara watched her, eyes narrow with focus, then mimicked the motion. "I like it better here," the girl said suddenly. "It's quieter than before." Odette looked at her. Before, Clara didn't answer, only tucked the egg into the basket and moved on to the next box. That night, after the children were asleep and the oil lamp burned low on the table, Clayton came in from the barn, his coat damp across the shoulders. He hung it by the door and crossed to the hearth, easing himself down on the bench beside her. She didn't speak at first, only passed him the last of the coffee, now cooled to warmth. He took it without a word. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked, eyes on the fire. "I think about tomorrow, and the next fence post. I mean past that, planting, harvest. A life." He turned the tin mug in his hands. "I never used to think that far, but lately I catch myself doing just that." She drew her knees up into the chair, wrapping her arms round them. "Clara said she likes it better now. I think she feels safe." He nodded once. "Cooper asked me if he could learn to ride the roan gelding. He's thinking ahead, too." Odette looked over at him. "Do you think we've made something here? Not just shelter, but a home," he finished. She met his gaze. "Yes." He set the mug aside and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I've been meaning to ask you something, and I don't want you to answer just for the children's sake." "I wouldn't." He took a breath. "Would you marry me, Odette? Not because Levy meant for it, because I do." She looked at him for a long time, her chest tight with something too full to name. "Yes," she said softly. "Yes, I will." Clayton reached for her hand, and she gave it to him, fingers slipping into his like they'd always meant to fit there. Outside, a coyote called once lonely, distant, but the night held no fear. Not anymore. They lit a second lamp and sat closer. He told her about his mother, how she'd taught him to read the sky for weather, and Odette told him how her sister used to sing to the wind, believing it carried songs farther than voices alone. He laughed, not loudly, but with warmth that lived in his eyes more than his voice. She watched the way the lines around his mouth deepened when he smiled, and she felt something settle inside her, calm as still water. The fire burned low, but neither of them moved to tend it. The cabin was quiet, save the soft creak of wood and the hush of their breathing. Nothing rushed them. Nothing needed saying that hadn't already been understood. Spring would come in full soon, with green shoots and long days and work that never ended. But tonight, they had this two hands joined beneath the lamp's glow and the quiet certainty of something lasting. By late May, the air had turned sweet and thick with the breath of new grass. The cabin sat wrapped in green now, the riverbank swollen but stable, the ridge above flecked with early wildflowers. Coop had taken to riding the gelding in slow, looping paths around the pasture, and Clara spent her mornings following a pair of goslings she'd named Wilbert and Me, her voice soft as she made up stories for them that only she and the birds seemed to understand. The wedding had been quiet. Just the four of them, standing under the cottonwood where the creek bent, a preacher from Rawlins who'd ridden out at Clayton's request and stayed only long enough to bless the vows and drink a cup of strong coffee. Odette wore a blue dress she'd sewn herself, with tiny white stitches along the hem, and Cooper had given her a single feather he'd found that morning, brown and silver, and smooth as a promise. Now she stood at the cabin's edge, brushing her hands against her apron, watching as Clayton came up from the lower fence line. His sleeves were rolled back, the backs of his hands sun-darkened, and he carried a coil of wire slung over one shoulder. "You think we'll need to widen the pen?" he asked, glancing past her toward the shed where the sow had begun nesting in earnest. "She's heavy with more than a few," Odette said. "Could be 7 or 8 if she carries like the last one did. She's clever." "She'll do fine," he said, lifting the coil from his shoulder and resting it against the wall. "You sleeping all right?" "I am," she said. "It's just different not being alone." He studied her face. "Still feel like a guest?" "No." She brushed a strand of hair from her brow. I feel like I belong to the land now, like my name's settled in the dirt with everything else we've planted. Clayton stepped closer, his voice low and certain. The land's better for having you on it. She leaned against him, the soft creak of his shirt against her ear, and felt his hand settle at the small of her back. That evening they sat outside with the children, snapping peas beside the porch while the sun sank behind the ridge. The sky turned a deep orange, then bruised purple, and the first stars blinked above the pines. Cooper leaned against the porch rail, scratching out letters on a scrap of wood with the tip of a nail, and Clara fell asleep curled beside the dog they'd taken in weeks ago, a three-legged shepherd that never strayed far from her side. Clayton tapped his fingers against the arm of the rocking chair. I could add another room, a small one toward the east wall, would give us space to spread. You think we'll need it? Odette asked. I do, he said, his eyes on her belly. Come winter, we'll have one more. She reached for his hand, cradling it in both of hers. I suspected, just wasn't sure how to say it. You don't need to say a thing, he said. I see it in you. They sat like that until the wind cooled against their skin and the lamp inside the cabin flickered in the window behind them. In August, the baby came. A girl, dark-haired with strong lungs and long fingers. Odette named her Eliza after her mother, and Clayton carried her outside the next morning, lifting her gently to show her the fields, the hills, the cabin, all of it bathed in golden light. That autumn, the harvest came in full. Potatoes by the bushel, beans strung and dried, onions braided and hung from the rafters. Odette taught Clara how to fold dough with soft hands, and Cooper learned to set traps by the creek, checking them each morning with a quiet pride that grew steadier by the week. At night, after the children were asleep and the air grew sharp with frost, Clayton would pull the quilt over their shoulders and rest his hand against the curve of her hip, his breath warm against her neck. You still glad you came? He asked once. She turned toward him, her voice steady in the dark. Every day, years passed, each season folding into the next, they built a second barn, then a smokehouse. The children grew strong and sure. Clara took to drawing birds in the margins of her schoolbook, and Cooper carved a fiddle from cedar and learned to play it by ear, filling the evenings with music that drifted past the porch and into the long grass beyond. Clayton and Odette grew older, but never apart. When they walked the fence line, they did it with hands clasped. When they spoke, it was with the ease of two lives fully entwined. There were hard winters, of course, sickness and injury, long days with no rest, but they never faced them alone. And when the storms came, when the wind roared and the snow piled high, the cabin held fast warm with firelight, laughter, and the quiet certainty of love well earned. They buried the shepherd beneath the cottonwood when the time came and planted marigolds over the spot where he slept. And each spring, when the blooms returned, Clara would sit beside them and hum, her voice low, the same way her mother once had. Odette's hair turned silver with time and Clayton's steps slowed, but his hand never left hers, not once, not through the long walks at dusk, nor the still mornings when they watched the land they'd built stretch wide and golden around them. And when they sat on the porch, with Eliza's children running in the grass and Cooper's fiddle rising sweet through the air, they knew they had done what few managed. They had made a life rooted in truth, in labor, in quiet, enduring love, together always, through it all.